What happens if an Aboriginal woman's spouse dies? Is the 6-month grace period adequate before eviction is enforced?
For the spouse being able to occupy the home for 180 days, I'm not sure if it's even safe for that person to be there the 180 days, because if, regardless of legislation, if they don't want you on the reserve, they're going to make your life very difficult to live on the reserve. So it doesn't matter what happens with this bill, that still might not be possible.
Definitely it is a weakness, but in a sense too it's a strength, because at least it's going to give them 6 months to try to deal with it. But it's a weakness unless there's also measures put in place to help these individuals, because when you go out into the real world to rent an apartment or to try to find alternative living arrangements, you're normally required to put down your damage deposit, your first and last month's rent. There's a cost to hooking up utilities, and most of these individuals coming from these communities normally are on social assistance. And if you're coming to the provincial side of the house, you can't get social assistance, I know from the province I come from, unless you have a permanent address. So where do these people go? They're going to end up in a shelter with people with other problems, exposing their children to this stuff and themselves. They'll end up in a women's shelter. And if it's not an Aboriginal women's shelter, a normal everyday shelter, they're not going to understand the dynamics that's going to be at play here. Second stage housing, very scarce. And Aboriginal off-reserve housing, even scarcer.
This is obviously a gap that needs to be addressed somehow, and I think that exploring this bill further will help us to identify what other supports that we can cluster around this issue.
I would be surprised if they actually get to stay there for the full 6 months. So I don't know, that maybe the legislation might be there, but I don't know how you would police or enforce that. We have women also that not only, they might not even come off reserve to get information about housing or any assistance, because they don't even know that we exist. So we have women that stay in their own situations, and sometimes I guess it would be abusive and things like that, because they don't leave. And sometimes when they do leave, if their children are older, sometimes they have to put up with issues from their own kids.
Can court orders concerning matrimonial real property be enforced on reserve?
I believe they can be enforced. The RCMP are a federal policing agency, and I believe that they can enforce them on reserve. But I think there would have to be, if they have their own police services on reserve, there would have to be some sort of a cooperation between the two services, working together to ensure. But in a sense too, yeah, you can enforce them, but what are the ramifications to the enforcement, to the individual? And that's one thing that people have to be very conscious of, and that you can't impose things on people or a community that they're not going to trust or like.
There is a role that the provinces and territories can take in that, but of course there needs to be communication and an understanding of the circumstances that they're facing on reserve. So as far as just going in there and enforcing is not going to be the solution, because you're going to have a lot of people who are going to be opposing that. So I think it's open lines of communication. Obviously you have to make sure that you're doing your job properly, but be fair and consistent, I think.
I think it would be easier to create, assistance for the men and women, and more often it is the women and young women, who become mothers who have to leave. But I think it would be easier to create legislation that would support those people coming off and create education and awareness of what programs and services are available to them.
Yeah, and I do believe the police can enforce the court orders for the 10 minutes that they're on the reserve to do it. But the minute they're off, it's not going to happen. There's nobody there to help those women.
What involvement did your organization have with Bill C-8, Family Homes on Reserves, and Matrimonial Interests or Rights Act?
Well, I believe it's a start. If anything, this bill has started the dialogue in the communities, both on and off reserve. And it's making us realize that we can no longer shove it under the rug of domestic violence in the home. It's not something that's just happening on reserve. It happens both on and off reserve. And we seem to have had a fear of discussing this issue. So if anything, this bill has opened the dialogue, and people are going to have to deal with it. It's a fact of life, and we can't hide this any longer.
I think that somebody needs to be out there advocating on behalf of the rights of the women and the children, and also, as has been mentioned, men who are affected by the same sort of issues. So I really think that it's a great step forward for CAP to be the organization to push this issue through.
Aboriginal women living on reserves do not have the same rights as other women in Canada. This unfair and unconstitutional discrimination needs to end. The right to a fair share of matrimonial property on the breakup of a marriage or a common law relationship needs to be supported by legislation. For years, Aboriginal women have been struggling for recognition of these rights, and the time for action is now.